Okay, we are hoping that Anthony's not too rusty after a long layoff, but we are bated breath basically, so the floor
Just
is
keep
yours.
it baited, that's all I need to know.
And Anthony will be remaining seated in case you're wondering why. He just feels at this stage that bouncing around on his feet, marching up and down is just slightly beyond him. So we understand that. Okay.
I don't think you've got one. Everyone now got one of the leaflets, please? Yeah. Just a very quick with the leaflet. First of all, the picture there at the front. The guy standing is Gaskin, who I'm going to talk about, the murderer. Okay. As someone very clearly and quietly pointed out, the medal that he's got on his uniform there, that's not an English medal, is it? It's an Iron Cross, the German Army. And I will tell you about that during the talk. Very proud of that he was, and how he got it. And then inside there is a picture of his wife that he murdered, and she's the lady in the light dress. Give you an idea, when they married in 1913, she was 17 and he was 21. Now these pictures are roughly taken 6 years later, or 5 years later. So she would be about 23 and he would be about 26, 27. Okay? And the picture at the bottom, the picture at the bottom, that actually was a postcard that they sold advertising the murder. They'd sell anything in those days, wouldn't they, you know? And that's it. And the things that are on it, I will be talking about during the talk. Okay? So it'll give you a rough idea. I always think it's very difficult. How do you start? Do you use the word story? Because it's not a story, it actually is a true event. So I think episode might be the best way to start it off with. Begins roughly in 1913, when they meet one another, and probably because he was involved with her brothers in petty theft around Hensford. And by petty theft, I mean it really was petty, nicking people's washing off the lines and selling it to somebody else and stuff like that, but getting themselves quite a reputation. And I think, in fact, Gaskin probably met her because of his association with her two brothers. And they actually married in July of 1913. They then moved, by the way, must tell you, she was pregnant when they got married, but it wasn't his. And that is a recurring theme through the course of it. Her being pregnant and the children not being his. Okay, so they moved first of all to his mother's house in Bridgetown. They lived at number 45 on Longford Road in Bridgetown. That building isn't there any longer. Some of the houses are, but that building now is part, I think they're all now semi-industrial estate, little units. And they stayed there for a couple of weeks with his mother, and then they found themselves a flat in St John's Road in Cannock. They didn't stay there very long, and then the next we have them, still in the same year, is they've moved next door to Lizzie's mother. Now we're talking about her was Elizabeth Talbot, when her parents were Talbots, and he in fact was Gaskin, Thomas Henry Gaskin. The Talbots, by the way, always argued about this story ever being told, because every time you wanted to try and put the story in a book or anything like that, one of the family used to object, because they're still going around Hensford even now, the Talbots are. But eventually, I think the last living relative who knew her died a few years ago. So it's now okay to actually print the story. and talk about it. Now, they were okay with their marriage, even though she was pregnant and it wasn't his, and she'd had the child. But in the next year, 1914, he was sent to prison. He was finally caught with his petty theft, and I think the authorities had had enough of him, and so they sent him to prison, Portland prison, down south. I did write to the governor there to find out exactly what he had done to get there. But unfortunately the records, or so the governor wrote back, very nice letter, wrote back and said, sorry, but during the war the prison was bombed and all the records were burnt. You know, so they had no records before 1945 or something like that in the prison. The whole lot went up in flames. It was quite usual, because it was only petty crime there is there, quite usual that in fact he was asked, did he want to join the army to get out of prison, because the First World War was happening. And he actually agreed that he would sign papers so that he could be released from prison, and he joined the forces, and he joined the tunnellers. Now, Hensford had quite a history of tunnellers. Usually, I think the guy who started the whole thing was a chap called Josh Paynton, and he was the guy who actually started the fire brigade in Hensford. He started the ambulance brigade in Hensford, and he started the pit rescue in Hensford. And one of his jobs was actually to train tunnellers in Hensford, and people volunteered and went off to the front, and Gaskin was one of them. He didn't come back to Hensford. He was trained while he was in sort of the barracks. Now, the following year, that was 1916. In 1917, he got a week's furlough and came home. And obviously, the first thing he wanted to do was to go to his wife, who he found had yet another child. Now, whether his letters were extremely sexy from prison, I don't know. But it was pretty obvious that that child wasn't his either. So that was the second child that he quite happily agreed to, and he forgave her. But during the course of his stay in for only a week, they had a tremendous argument. He left and went to stay with his mother. But give her a due, Elizabeth wasn't one of these people who just sat back and ignored things. She followed him. And an almighty row happened in the garden of number 45, Longford Road. And the next door neighbour, Daisy Winfer, actually heard them arguing, and she heard Gaskin turn round and say, if you don't shut up, I'll bloody kill you. She went home. He went off back to war. November 1918, he is demobbed, and he comes back to Hensford to find she's pregnant again. This time with a chap who is an ex-soldier and living up at the RAF camps. And her answer to him is, I don't care what you say. If you don't look after me, Monty will. But by the way, you'll pay maintenance money. Now, if you expect someone to pay maintenance money for 3 children, none of whom are his, you know, you've got to be pretty sick. But she was determined. Unfortunately for him, he got himself a job at West Cannock number 3's pit. Now, if you know Hensford, I don't know if you know Hensford, over the bridge, Station Road and Cannock Road, and then going towards Rugeley, Takaroo, that is one long road from Takaroo to Cannock up to the Bridge pub on the top. And West Cannock number 3's pit is near there. She lives in Takaroo, which is at the farther end of the road. So it was nothing for her to just walk along the road, and every time he was going to the pit, to appear and demand money off him. He wanted a divorce, She said there was no way he was going to have a divorce. She wanted the money to keep the children. By now, she'd had the baby with Monty the soldier. She'd had him in the January. By February, Gaskin had had enough. And we come to the main day. February the 19th, 1919, it's a Wednesday. Pubs used to open early in those days, hadn't they? During the week. They'd open at 10 o'clock in the morning, some of them would. And they'd close at about 2, and then they'd open up again at 6 and close at 10 at night. He was seen in the Uxbridge Arms at about 10 o'clock on that Wednesday morning. He'd bumped into a chap called Gary, Mr. Gary, who was on his way to work. And Mr. Gary always liked a couple of pints before he went to work. Some people did have pints either when they were going on the way to work or on the way back. And he persuaded Gaskin to go in the Uxbridge and have a pint with him. Unfortunately, Gaskin didn't drink, or very rarely had a drink. He was a chain smoker, but he didn't really drink. But he went in and he had a pint. Gary persuaded him as well then to carry on with him, and they went up to the top of the hill to the plough and arrow on the top of the hill. And they had another pint there. Now you imagine somebody who doesn't particularly drink to somebody who's already had 2 pints. Whether or not he's picking up courage, we're not sure. But at 12:30, he's in the Anglesey, which is now Hensford Lodge, which is run by Wetherspoons, at the bottom in the main area of the town. He's in there having another drink and chatting to a man called Thomas Saunders. And Thomas Saunders lives next door to the Talbots in Takaroo. And Elizabeth is obviously back living with her mother. So he says to Thomas, "Can you take this note for me to Elizabeth?" And the note simply read, "Meet me by the pool immediately." Now, for those people who don't know Hensford, Hensford at one time had a lake. If you know where the park is in Hensford, along the Rudgley Road, the park is down in a dip. Now that used to be the lake. They drained it. Well, they didn't drain it. What they did, when the pool pits opened, where the museum is today in Hensford, to stop the pits flooding, they diverted a brook that used to run down the valley and into the lake in Hensford. And they diverted it to take it down the Rudgley Road to Rudgley. What happened then to the lake was it gradually, over the years, it dried up and became just a bit of boggy land in winter. But people in Hensford still knew it as the pool. So that when the note said, "Meet me by the pool," Elizabeth knew exactly where he meant, along the Rudgley Road. Despite her mother's objection, Elizabeth put a coat on and her gloves and a hat on, and off she went. Now, during the trial, 3 people came forward and said they saw Elizabeth and a man going along Rudgley Road towards where today's museum is. I don't know if you know where the museum is in Hensford. Up the hill, I think it's called Valley Road, up Valley Road, opposite the park. And they saw them walking along there. Now there was Henry Borton, and Henry Borton worked in the pit offices. Now those are the pit offices on that first little photograph. The first photograph are the pit offices, and they used to be right on the corner by Valley Road when you went up to the museum. They're now new houses have built there. They were pulled down. And Henry Borton said he was in the office in one of the rooms looking out onto Rudgley Road, and he noticed this couple walking along the road, and the reason he noticed them because they were arguing with one another. He saw them turn the corner and walk up the road as if they were going towards the pit, which was at the top where the museum is today. That was originally the pit. And he then saw them cross over into the woods called the plantation. And you can just about see the woods there. I'll assure you that bank, that dark bank, are trees. And they crossed over and went into there. Now, two other people saw them going. One was Nora Degwell, and she lived in a row of cottages along the Rudgley Road called the Cell Cottages, and a Sarah Southall who lived in a cottage which stood on the hill called Pool View. They lived in those houses. And each one told the same story. The couple going along the Rudgley Road at about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were arguing with one another. And then they suddenly disappeared into the plantation. Now that plantation has ever since had the nickname Gaskin's Wood. You ask anybody in Hensford, well, most of the elderly people, where Gaskin's Wood is, and they'll tell you. If you ask them where the plantation is, they won't have a clue what you're talking about. Because it's always been, I remember as a kid, and I'm talking now in the 1940s, when I used to go there, and we used to frighten the life out of one another. Because it's only been, what, 20, 30 years before that the murder took place, and you'd always get somebody who say, "I found something," and good, everybody would scatter, you know, kids running all over the place screaming. But it's always been nicknamed Gaskin's Wood. Now why? When they got into the wood, that's the last you see of Elizabeth Gaskin alive. What happened in there was horrendous. When the post-mortem happened, there wasn't a part of her body that hadn't got bruising or cuts. He must have gone terribly berserk and left the body in the woods and then disappeared. Now that's round about 3, half 3 on the Wednesday afternoon. 4:30 is noticed walking along the Cannock Road, near where he works. That's along the Extension Station Road, and a chap called Josh Roadway says hello to him, and he replies hello back. They don't have any more of a chat, but Josh Roadway at the trial said he seemed perfectly okay. Didn't notice any blood on his clothing. 5 o'clock, he's on the bus going back to Bridgetown. And Daisy Winfer, the next door neighbour, sees him on the bus and says hello. And he says hello back, but that's it. No conversation. At 6 o'clock, he goes to the cinema with his brother. That's this chap here. And they go to the cinema in Bridgetown. At about 6 o'clock. At 6:30, he leaves the cinema and goes back to Hensford. Goes back to the plantation, and he proceeds to start cutting the body up. Now, all he's got is a little pit knife. I don't know any of you ever worked down the pit. In the years when you went, my dad took with him a little baccy knife, as he called it. And he had a little tin, and in the tin was raw tobacco. And it was a bit like a twist, they call it. It was twist, they called it. And it was a bit like cherry wood type thing. And they used to cut a little bit off to chew, and that meant when they could then cough up any of the dust that they were collecting in their lungs. It didn't stop them getting pneumosilicosis, but at least they tried hard. And so that's all he got with him. Now, ladies will know, I don't know, gentlemen might know as well. When police forensics are looking at a human body, the nearest alternative they've got, they can't use a body, is pig. It's the nearest thing to human skin, is pig flesh. And you ladies will know very, very well how difficult it is to cut a pork chop off a piece of pork. You'll saw away like the neck until you finally get it off. Now you're probably doing it with a carving knife. You try doing it with a little knife that size, you know, the blade that size. He got the head off. He got the head off quite happily. And then he started on the leg. Unfortunately, the knife was getting blunt. So by the time he'd almost got through the leg, which was dangling off, he had to leave it. And he just left it, but he was quite conscious of the fact that if he did leave it, it might be found quite easily. So he took the body and he stuck the body in a little culvert, which was basically a little tunnel which drained water off the pit banks down and across the road and into the pool still. Now the head he could dispose of. So the head tucked under his arm and off he went to Ensford. And he went to the gasometers. Now if you're not sure where the gasometers were, the gasometers there, they were actually where Tesco's car park is today. That's where the gasometers were. They weren't used because Hainsford was getting very modern, had almost got electricity. You know, so they were used occasionally still. But the gas that was in them had to be protected from spontaneous combustion in the summertime. And so what the gasometer had was it had an exterior little wall that went, an exterior metal wall that went round it, and that was filled with water. And that would keep the gas cool, so it wouldn't actually explode or set off, combust itself spontaneously. I'll get that word out sooner or later. And he plunked the head in there. That meant he had to climb a wall which was about 5 foot high to get over there, but he got over and put the head there and then went home. Thursday morning, Mrs. Talbot, her mother, arrives at Gaskin's house, wanting to know where Elizabeth is. She hasn't come home. He turns round and says, I don't know, she didn't meet me. She's not happy with that statement, so she goes off to the police and reports her daughter missing. Gaskin then decides he's got to do something extra. So when it gets a little bit dark, and remember it's February, so it's dark around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he goes back to Hensford, gets a wheelbarrow, gets the body out of the culvert, plonks it in the wheelbarrow, and he's about to set off, and then he suddenly realises that it's a bit frosty on the ground and the wheelbarrow's making marks. So he leaves the wheelbarrow, puts the body over his shoulder and off again to the gasometer. Before he puts the body in, he finds a metal rod 5 foot big and he rams it down her throat, right through and out the vagina, and then gets the body in and then goes home. Friday morning, he's a little concerned, so he goes off to Birmingham. And he meets a fella at Birmingham station, and he persuades this fella to write a note for him. and the note's to be sent to Mrs. Talbot. And that note simply says, "Don't worry about me, mother. I've gone to London with a friend. I'll tell you when I get there, and I'll let you know how things are." Happy with that, he goes back and he goes to the pit, to his job. The police by now have searched all through the woods and everything. They haven't found a body, obviously, because it's been removed. But nevertheless, they decide Gaskin needs to be questioned. So they turn up at the pit, the number 3 pit, and just before he's about to go down the pit, they arrest him and take him off to Cannock Jail, not to Hensford, because he said to them when they arrest him, "Please don't take me to Hensford Jail. I want to go to Cannock instead." Don't know why. Perhaps thought people might recognise him being taken in. When they arrest him, he's got with him the little knife, and he's also got a lamp with him as well, because he's going down the pit. That lamp could also be used when he's at the culvert. And they take him in for questioning all through the evening, and the next day he's determined he knows nothing about Elizabeth's disappearance. On the Saturday morning, Mrs. Talbot receives the note from Birmingham, and she takes it immediately to the police. They still haven't got a body. Now, in those days it was very rare to take anyone to court unless there was an actual body. So they were still insisting on interviewing him time and time again. He kept to his story. On the Sunday afternoon, Inspector Murray was just about to sit down to his Sunday dinner, and he gets a phone call from Cannock Police Station. "Can you come immediately? Gaskin's decided to tell us where he's hidden the body." He goes off to Cannock Police Station, and when he's interviewing Gaskin, Gaskin says, "You better bring a couple of drag ropes with you, then you might be able to retrieve the body. I cut her up and I've put her in the gasometer." So off they pile into taxis, police cars, and they make their way to Hensford. They have to climb the 5-foot wall, which he did remember with the body. They climb that and they go to the gasometer, and you can see the police there in that picture. They're actually round there looking at what's happened. That's the 3rd picture.